The conference room at Sterling Media Solutions buzzed with the kind of energy that comes before a storm. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago's bustling financial district, where autumn leaves danced against the glass like confetti celebrating someone else's victory. I sat at the polished oak table, my presentation materials spread before me, ready to deliver the quarterly client retention report that had taken me 3 weeks to perfect. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Marcus Sterling, the company's founder and CEO, adjusted his reading glasses as he flipped through his agenda. At 62, he still commanded respect with his sharp suits and sharper mind, though lately the weight of running a media empire seemed to press harder on his shoulders. Across from him sat his son, Brandon Sterling, 28 years old with an MBA he'd bought from an Ivy League school and an ego that filled the room like expensive cologne. Brandon lounged in his chair like he owned the place, which technically he would someday. His designer watch caught the light as he scrolled through his phone, barely acknowledging the other executives filing into their seats. Regional directors, department heads, and senior managers took their positions around the table, creating a semicircle of anticipation. "All right, people," Marcus began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd built a company from nothing. "Let's start with client retention. Sarah, you're up." I stood, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor as I moved to the presentation screen. For 7 years, I'd been Sterling Media's Director of Client Relations, the person who turned angry customers into loyal advocates and transformed near disasters into success stories. My track record spoke for itself. A 94% client retention rate, the highest in company history. "Good morning, everyone," I began, clicking to my first slide. "I'm pleased to report that Q3 shows continued growth in client satisfaction, with retention rates holding steady at 94.2%. Murmurs of approval rippled around the table. Patricia Williams from legal nodded appreciatively, while David Chen from operations scribbled notes. But Brandon's expression remained unchanged, his fingers still dancing across his phone screen. I continued through the presentation, highlighting successful client recoveries, new account acquisitions, and the strategic partnerships I developed with key industry players. Everything was going smoothly until I reached the final slide, a proposal for expanding our client success team to handle the growing workload. To maintain these numbers, we'll need to invest in additional staff. I recommend hiring 2 junior client managers and upgrading our CRM system. The total investment would be $180,000, but projected returns show... Stop right there. Brandon's voice cut through the room like a blade. He finally looked up from his phone, his ice blue eyes fixed at me with barely concealed contempt. "Dad, this is exactly the problem I've been talking about." The room went silent. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What problem, son?" Brandon stood, his movement fluid and predatory. He walked to the presentation screen and gestured dismissively at my carefully crafted slides. "This whole department is dead weight. Sarah's been coasting for years, throwing money at problems instead of solving them efficiently." My stomach dropped, but I kept my expression neutral. "Brandon, if you look at the numbers..." "The numbers lie," he interrupted, his voice rising with confidence. "Any monkey can maintain existing clients. Real growth comes from acquisition, from hunting new business, not babysitting companies that are already paying us." He turned to face the room, playing to his audience. "We're hemorrhaging money on feel-good client relations when we should be lean, aggressive, and focused on the future." Heat crept up my neck, but I forced myself to remain professional. Client retention directly impacts our bottom line. Losing existing clients costs 5 times more than... Enough. Brandon slammed his hand on the table, making several coffee cups rattle. "Dad, I've been watching this department drag us down for months. Sarah's outdated, her methods are antiquated, and frankly, she's become a dead weight that is holding Sterling Media back from its true potential." The words hit me like a physical blow. Dead weight. In 7 years of dedicated service, through late nights and weekend emergencies, through crisis management and relationship building, I had become dead weight in the eyes of the heir apparent. I looked around the room, searching for support, for someone to defend the track record I'd built. Patricia avoided my eyes, suddenly fascinated by her legal pad. David cleared his throat uncomfortably but said nothing. Even Marcus, who'd personally thanked me dozens of times for saving major accounts, sat in stony silence. Brandon sensed his victory and pressed forward. I motion that we eliminate the entire client relations department. Sarah can finish out the month, but we need to cut dead weight if we want to compete in today's market. Second, came a voice from the back of the room. I turned to see James Morrison from finance, a man I'd helped secure a major client just 6 months ago, raising his hand in agreement. The betrayal stung worse than Brandon's insults. These weren't strangers. These were colleagues I'd worked beside, people whose departments I'd supported, whose crises I'd helped resolve. And now they sat in silence or actively supported my professional execution? Marcus finally spoke, his voice measured but tired. Brandon raises interesting points about operational efficiency. He looked at me, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been regret. Sarah, I think we need to reevaluate your position. Take the rest of the day to think things over. The dismissal was polite but final. I gathered my materials with hands that trembled only slightly, maintaining the composure that had carried me through 7 years of high-stakes client negotiations. As I walked toward the door, Brandon's voice followed me like a shadow. Nothing personal, Sarah. It's just business. I paused at the threshold and turned back, meeting his smirk with steady eyes. Of course it is, I said quietly. It's always just business. The door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded like the end of an era. I walked through the open office space where my junior colleagues looked up with curious expressions, past the break room where I'd celebrated countless victories, beyond the reception desk where Miranda always greeted me with a smile. I didn't stop until I reached the parking garage where my silver Honda Civic waited in its designated spot, a spot I'd occupied faithfully for 7 years, through snow and rain, early mornings and late nights. Only then did I allow myself to lean against the driver's side door and take a shuddering breath. Dead weight. The words echoed in my mind as I drove through Chicago's afternoon traffic. Brandon Sterling, a man who'd never closed a deal or saved a relationship in his life, had just dismantled my career in front of the entire leadership team. And worse, they'd let him do it. By the time I reached my apartment in Lincoln Park, the shock had begun to transform into something else, something colder and more focused. I climbed the stairs to my second-floor unit, my heels echoing in the narrow hallway like a countdown to whatever came next. Inside my modest apartment, surrounded by the books and plants that had always brought me peace, I finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. 7 years of building relationships, of turning Sterling Media into a company that clients actually wanted to work with, dismissed as dead weight by a privileged son who'd never earned anything in his life. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my living room window, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening darkness. Somewhere out there, Brandon Sterling was probably celebrating his victory, convinced he'd rid his father's company of unnecessary baggage. He had no idea what he'd just set in motion. As I sipped my wine, a memory surfaced from 3 years ago. A conversation I'd had with Rebecca Martinez, CEO of Pinnacle Marketing Group, Sterling Media's main competitor. We'd met at an industry conference, and she'd tried to recruit me over drinks, offering a substantial raise and equity in her growing company. If you ever get tired of playing second fiddle, she'd said, with a knowing smile, give me a call. Someone with your client relationships and industry knowledge could do incredible things with the right backing. I'd politely declined then.
loyal to Sterling Media and confident in my future there. But Rebecca had given me her personal card. And unless I was mistaken, it was still tucked away in my jewelry box. A relic of a road not taken. Until now. I finished my wine and went to retrieve the card, its embossed logo still crisp after 3 years. As I held it up to the light, studying Rebecca's direct cell phone number, I felt something I hadn't experienced in the conference room today. Hope. Brandon Sterling thought he'd eliminated dead weight, but he had actually just freed the one person who knew all of Sterling Media's secrets, all their client relationships, and all their weaknesses. Tomorrow, I would start making some phone calls. Tonight, I would begin planning the most important negotiation of my career, one that would teach the Sterling family that sometimes what you discard as dead weight becomes your biggest threat. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Pinnacle Marketing Group's downtown Chicago offices as I sat across from Rebecca Martinez, the woman who had either become my salvation or witnessed my final professional failure. At 45, Rebecca had built Pinnacle from a scrappy startup into Sterling Media's most formidable competitor, and her reputation for calculated moves and strategic thinking preceded her into every boardroom in the city. "Sarah Chen," she said, leaning back in her ledger chair with a smile that was equal welcoming and predatory. "When I got your call yesterday, I'll admit, I was intrigued. 7 years at Sterling Media, then suddenly you're interested in exploring new opportunities." I kept my expression neutral, though inside my heart was racing. This meeting would determine everything. Whether I'd spend the next few months updating my resume and facing rejection after rejection, or whether I'd have the platform I needed to show Brandon Sterling exactly what dead weight could accomplish.
Let's just say my perspective on loyalty has recently been clarified, I replied carefully. But before we discuss opportunities, I should be transparent about my situation. I haven't officially left Sterling yet, but it's only a matter of time. Rebecca's eyes sharpened with interest. Marcus finally decided to clean the house? More like his son decided to make executive decisions without understanding the consequences. I kept my voice level, professional, but Rebecca was too experienced not to catch the undercurrent of steel beneath my words. She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her desk. "Brandon, I've heard stories about the prodigal prince. Takes after his father in ambition, but lacks the wisdom that comes from building something from nothing." She paused, studying my face. "What did he do?" I told her about the meeting, about being called dead weight, about watching colleagues I'd helped choose silence over support. Rebecca listened without interruption, her expression growing more intrigued with each detail. When I finished, she sat back and laughed. Not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation. "Do you know what Sterling Media's biggest vulnerability is, Sarah? Their client relationships depend heavily on personal connections rather than systematic processes. If you remove the relationship managers, especially ones who've built trust over years, their retention rates would plummet within 6 months." Exactly. And do you know who manages the majority of their high-value client relationships? I did. Rebecca's smile widened. Past tense noted. "Here's what I'm thinking, and tell me if this sounds interesting to you." She turned her computer monitor so I could see a detailed spreadsheet showing Pinnacle's current market position relative to Sterling Media. We're about 60% of their size, but we're growing faster, and our profit margins are better. What we lack is their client base and their industry connections. She clicked to another screen showing Sterling Media's client roster, information that should have been confidential, but apparently wasn't in the age of LinkedIn and industry databases. Now, hypothetically, what would happen if someone with intimate knowledge of these client relationships, someone these clients trusted and respected, were to join a competitor? Hypothetically, I said, playing along with her game, that person might be able to identify which clients were unhappy with their current service, which contracts were coming up for renewal, and which decision makers might be open to exploring alternatives. And if that same person had, say, equity in the competing company, they might be highly motivated to ensure those clients received exceptional service during their transition. I felt a thrill of excitement run through me. Are you offering me equity? I'm offering you something better than equity, Rebecca said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I'm offering you a partnership, full partner, with voting rights and profit sharing. But more than that, I'm offering you the chance to build something that's yours. She turned to a fresh page in her notebook and began sketching out organizational charts. Here's my proposal. Pinnacle acquires a controlling interest in a new subsidiary focused specifically on client relations and retention. You'd run it completely. Hire your own team, set your own processes, keep 90% of the profits your division generates. My breath caught. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a chance to build the kind of client-focused company I'd always dreamed about without the constraints of working under someone else's vision. But here's the beautiful part, Rebecca continued, her eyes gleaming with strategic delight. Since you'd be a partner in Pinnacle overall, any major acquisition decisions, like, say, acquiring struggling competitors, would require your input and approval. The implication hit me like lightning. If Sterling Media's client base eroded enough, if their revenue dropped significantly due to poor client relations, they might become vulnerable to acquisition. And as a partner in Pinnacle, I'd have a say in whether that acquisition happened. You're talking about buying Sterling Media, I said slowly. I'm talking about being prepared for opportunities, Rebecca corrected smoothly. If a competitor were to lose significant market share due to poor strategic decisions, well, that might create interesting possibilities for companies positioned to take advantage. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline where Sterling Media's building rose like a glass monument to Marcus Sterling's legacy. From here, it looked smaller somehow, more fragile. What would you need from me?
3 things. First, your expertise and relationships to build the strongest client services division in the city. Second, your insights into Sterling's weaknesses and vulnerabilities, purely for competitive intelligence, of course. Third, your patience. This kind of strategy takes time to execute properly. I turned back to face her. And what happens to Brandon when this is all over? Rebecca's smile was sharp as a blade. That depends entirely on how well he handles the pressure of watching his father's company slowly slip away. Some people rise to challenges. Others don't. We spent the next 2 hours hammering out details. Rebecca's offer was extraordinary. A 25% partnership stake in Pinnacle, full autonomy over my division, and a base salary that was double what Sterling had been paying me. But more than the money, it was the respect that sealed the deal. Rebecca saw me as a strategic asset, not dead weight. By the time I left Pinnacle's offices, I had a signed partnership agreement and a plan that would unfold over the next 18 months. Phase 1, establish my new division and begin systematically approaching Sterling's clients. Phase 2, use my industry connections to build Pinnacle's market share while monitoring Sterling's performance. Phase 3, position Pinnacle to acquire Sterling Media when Brandon's mismanagement inevitably caught up with him. That afternoon, I returned to Sterling Media to clean out my office and submit my resignation. The timing was perfect. Brandon was in meetings all day, so I didn't have to endure another confrontation. I packed my personal items quietly, said goodbye to the junior staff members who'd become like family over the years, and left my resignation letter on Marcus's desk. The letter was brief and professional. Effective immediately, I am resigning my position to pursue new opportunities. Thank you for 7 wonderful years. I wish Sterling Media continued success. I didn't mention Pinnacle, didn't reveal my plans, didn't give them any warning about what was coming. Let them think I was just another disgruntled employee slinking away with my tail between my legs. 3 days later, my phone rang. Marcus Sterling's name appeared on the caller ID. "Sarah, I just got your letter." His voice was strained,
older than I remembered. I think we may have been hasty in yesterday's meeting. Brandon was just passionate about efficiency. Why don't we come in and we'll discuss a counteroffer? I appreciate the call, Marcus, but I've already accepted another position. I start Monday. Where? The question was sharp, worried. I'd rather not say until I'm settled in. Professional courtesy, you understand? There was a long pause. Sarah, you know our clients. You have relationships that took years to build. If you're thinking of going to a competitor, I would never do anything unethical, I assured him, which was completely true. Everything I planned to do would be perfectly legal and above board. But Marcus, I have to ask, where was this concern for my value when Brandon was calling me dead weight in front of the entire leadership team? Another pause, longer this time. Brandon is young. He's learning. Sometimes his passion gets ahead of his judgment. I'm sure he is. Give him my regards. I ended the call and immediately blocked Marcus's number. There would be no more negotiations, no more attempts to lure me back with promises that would evaporate the moment Brandon decided I was inconvenient again. Instead, I spent the weekend preparing for my first week at Pinnacle. I researched every Sterling Media client, identified the ones most likely to be dissatisfied with their current service, and began planning my outreach strategy. Monday morning, I walked into Pinnacle's offices as a partner and division head, ready to build something that would make Brandon Sterling's dismissal of me look like the costliest mistake in his family's company history. By Tuesday, I'd made my first client contact, Angela Foster at Morrison Industries, one of Sterling's largest accounts. By Thursday, I had a lunch meeting scheduled with her for the following week. The game had begun, and this time, I was playing with house money and insider knowledge. Brandon Sterling had wanted to cut dead weight from his father's company. He was about to discover exactly how much that dead weight had been worth. 18 months later, I stood in the penthouse conference room of the Aon Center, 40 floors above Chicago's financial district, watching Brandon Sterling's hands shake as he fumbled with his presentation remote. The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same building where Sterling Media had held their quarterly board meetings, where I'd once presented client retention statistics to respectful nods and polite applause. Now I sat at the opposite end of the mahogany table as Sarah Chen, managing partner of Pinnacle Marketing Group, about to deliver the final blow to the company that had discarded me as dead weight.
The months between my departure from Sterling and this moment had unfolded like a masterpiece of strategic planning. Within 6 weeks of joining Pinnacle, I'd successfully convinced Morrison Industries to switch their $2.3 million annual contract from Sterling to my new client services division. Angela Foster had been surprisingly easy to convince. It turned out Brandon had personally insulted her during a contract negotiation, calling her marketing budget bloated and wasteful. Morrison Industries was just the beginning. Over the following year, I systematically approached every major Sterling client, not with aggressive poaching tactics, but with genuine relationship building and superior service offerings. My insider knowledge of Sterling's operational weaknesses allowed me to position Pinnacle's services exactly where our competitors were vulnerable. The results spoke for themselves. Pinnacle grew by 340% in 18 months, while Sterling Media hemorrhaged clients in revenue. By month 15, industry publications were running articles about Sterling's mysterious decline and Pinnacle's meteoric rise. Brandon, meanwhile, had responded to each client loss with increasingly desperate attempts to slash costs and streamline operations. Exactly the wrong approach for a service-based business. As you can see from slide 12, Brandon was saying, his voice betraying the strain of the past year, our operational efficiency improvements have reduced overhead by 32%. He clicked to a chart showing declining expenses, but anyone with basic business acumen could see the real story in his omitted metrics. Revenue had declined even faster than costs. Marcus Sterling sat beside his son, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 18 months. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms with quiet authority now seemed diminished, worn down by watching his life's work crumble under his heir's mismanagement. Rebecca Martinez, seated to my right as Pinnacle's CEO, caught my eye and raised an eyebrow. We both knew why we were here, why Sterling Media had requested this meeting. They needed an acquisition, a merger, something to stop the bleeding before bankruptcy became inevitable. What they didn't know was that Rebecca and I had been preparing for this moment since my first day at Pinnacle. We'd not only built our company into their primary competitor, we'd positioned ourselves to acquire them entirely. "Thank you, Brandon," I said when he finished his presentation, my voice carrying across the room with the authority I'd developed over months of high-stakes negotiation. "Those efficiency numbers are impressive. However, I'm curious about some metrics you didn't include." I stood and walked to the presentation screen, my heels clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that reminded me of another conference room, another confrontation, lifetimes ago. "For instance," I continued, pulling up my own presentation from my laptop, "your client retention rate has dropped from 94% to 67% over the past 18 months. Your average contract value has declined by 43%. And according to industry reports, 3 of your top 5 clients are currently exploring alternatives." Brandon's face flushed red. "Those numbers are taken out of context." "Are they?" I clicked to my next slide, which showed a side-by-side comparison of Sterling Media's declining performance against Pinnacle's growth curve. Because from where I sit, it looks like Sterling Media is a company in free fall, desperately cutting costs while losing the revenue base that made those costs sustainable in the first place. The room fell silent, except for the distant hum of Chicago traffic 40 floors below. Marcus cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Brandon gripped his presentation remote like a lifeline. "Sarah," Marcus finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation, "we're here because both our companies could benefit from a strategic partnership." "Partnership?" I let the word hang in the air for a moment, then smiled. Not warmly, but with the cool satisfaction of someone who'd spent 18 months maneuvering towards this exact moment. "Marcus, let's be honest about what this meeting is really about. You need a buyer before your company becomes worthless." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice smooth as silk. "Sterling Media is bleeding money, losing clients, and facing serious credibility issues in the market. This isn't about partnership, it's about survival." Brandon shot to his feet, his composure finally cracking. "You can't talk to us like that. My father built this company from nothing." "Your father did build something remarkable," I agreed, standing to face him across the table. "He built a company based on relationships, trust, and genuine client service. Then you decided all of that was dead weight." The words hit him like a physical blow. I could see the moment he remembered that conference room, that dismissive gesture, the casual cruelty with which he dismantled my career. "You did this on purpose. This whole thing, stealing our clients, building up Pinnacle, it was revenge." "It was business," I replied, using the same words he'd thrown at me 18 months ago. "I simply gave Sterling Media's former clients what they needed: competent account management, strategic thinking, and respect for their business relationships."
I clicked to my final slide, which showed Pinnacle's acquisition offer for Sterling Media. The number was fair, more than fair, considering Sterling's current position, but it represented a complete reversal of fortune from the family that had dismissed me so casually. "Here's our offer," I said, my voice steady and professional. "Pinnacle Marketing Group will acquire Sterling Media for $43 million, which is actually above market value given your current performance. Marcus, you'd retain a consulting role, and your pension would be fully protected. Brandon," I paused, meeting his eyes directly. Your position would be eliminated as redundant. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed. Brandon's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, while Marcus stared at the offer document like it was written in a foreign language. This is insane, Brandon finally managed. Dad, you can't seriously consider this. She's nobody. She's just a former director of client relations who built 90% of your revenue relationships. I finished smoothly. The same person you called dead weight before eliminating her position. The same person who, as it turns out, was holding your company together. Rebecca stood and placed the formal acquisition documents on the table. You have 48 hours to consider our offer. After that, we withdraw it and wait for the inevitable bankruptcy proceedings. As we prepared to leave, Marcus finally found his voice. Sarah, I want you to know, I never supported what Brandon said in that meeting. I should have stopped him, should have defended you. I paused at the door and looked back at the man who'd once been my respected boss. Marcus, the sad thing is, I believe you. But leadership isn't about what you support in private. It's about what you're willing to stand up for in public. You chose to stay silent when it mattered, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice. 2 days later, Rebecca called me with the news. Sterling Media had accepted our acquisition offer. The paperwork would take a few weeks to finalize, but for all practical purposes, the company that had dismissed me as dead weight now belonged to me. 6 months after the acquisition, I stood in what had once been Sterling Media's boardroom, now Pinnacle's Chicago headquarters, watching the sunset paint the city skyline in shades of gold and crimson. The transition had been smoother than expected. Most of Sterling's employees had kept their positions, grateful for the stability Pinnacle provided. Marcus had retired to his lake house in Wisconsin, and by all accounts, he was enjoying his consulting role and restored financial security. Brandon, however, had not adapted well to unemployment. According to industry gossip, he'd burned through his trust fund trying to start a competing agency, which had failed spectacularly within 4 months. His reputation in Chicago's marketing world was toxic. No one wanted to work with the man who'd driven his family's company into the ground through arrogance and poor judgment. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, no joy in his professional exile. Revenge, I'd discovered, was less sweet than simple justice. Brandon had created his own destruction through a combination of cruelty and incompetence. I'd simply refused to be a victim of it. My phone buzzed with a text from Angela Foster at Morrison Industries. Sarah, wanted you to know we just signed a 3-year extension. Thanks for everything you and your team do for us. I smiled, genuinely this time, as I looked around the room where I'd once been called dead weight. The irony was perfect. I now owned the company, employed most of the people who'd witnessed my humiliation, and built something far more valuable than what Brandon Sterling had tried to destroy. But the real victory wasn't in the acquisition or the reversal of fortune. It was in the realization that when someone tries to diminish your worth, the most powerful response isn't anger or revenge. It's simply proving them wrong through excellence and determination. As I gathered my things and prepared to head home, I reflected on the 18 months that had transformed me from a discarded employee to a company owner. The journey had taught me that being called dead weight by the wrong person might actually be the best thing that ever happens to your career. Sometimes the trash you throw away is actually treasure you were too blind to recognize. And sometimes that treasure comes back to buy your company. I turned off the lights in the boardroom and walked out into the Chicago evening. The owner of everything Brandon Sterling had once thought he was entitled to inherit. Tomorrow I'd continue building the kind of company I'd always dreamed of, one that valued relationships over ego, competence over privilege, and respect over casual cruelty. It was, I reflected as I waited for the elevator, the best possible outcome for everyone involved. Well, everyone except Brandon. But as he'd once told me, it was nothing personal. It was just business. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.